Hey friends, Elizabeth here from Plant-Based Bride. Welcome back to another video. In today's video, I am responding to the overwhelming demand on my December plan with me. So many of you wanted me to do an in-depth talk through of the process for painting the cover page for my setup. So that is what we're going to be doing in today's video. I have slowed down the footage much closer to real time. It is still sped up a tiny bit so that this video won't be super, ridiculously long, but it is much closer to real time, which will allow me to talk through everything in a lot more detail. So hopefully this is helpful for any of you who have wanted to recreate the painting, but you're not exactly sure where to start, or if you just want to practice painting and you want to hear some of the things that I've learned over the past year and a half that I've been painting with watercolors. So that said, I am not an expert with watercolors. I still consider myself pretty much a beginner, but I have definitely learned a few things here and there. So in this video, I will be sharing those tips and tricks with you. If you end up recreating this, I would love to see it. Please tag me on Instagram. I'm already getting tagged by so many of you, and your recreations are just amazing. Some of you are really taking it into your own hands and transforming it into something completely new, and it's just amazing to see. So thank you for tagging me. Please continue to do so if you recreate this painting. And without further ado, let's just jump right into the tutorial. First things first, this is the paper that I used to create all of the paintings in my December Plan With Me video. This is the Strathmore Vision watercolor paper. It is cold pressed, acid free, and 140-pound weight paper. I find it's a nice middle ground between super smooth watercolor paper and highly textured watercolor paper. Now, if you have watercolor paper at home, use that. You don't have to go out and buy new paper, but if you don't have any watercolor paper, I would highly recommend this paper. I quite like it. So my first tip is to tape down your paper to whatever surface you're painting on. Ideally, this will prevent your paper from warping too much while you're painting. You likely will still get some level of warping, especially if you're using a significant amount of water while you're painting, but taping it down can help to mitigate that. So the first thing I'm going to do is trace out very lightly in pencil the shape of the moon I'm going to be painting. So I used a bowl from my kitchen for the outside of the moon and then a lid of a candle for the inside. You can use whatever you have on hand. I wanted to get perfect curves. And once I drew that in, I actually erased the pencil marks to make them as light as humanly possible. They're still visible to the naked eye in person, but you can't even see them on screen because I erased them so much. I do this because once you paint over top of pencil marks, you can't erase them anymore. So I wanted to make them as light as possible so they wouldn't show through the paint. The next step is to wet the paper in the shape of the moon, carefully following that pencil mark that I can see in the top half where the sky is going to be. The idea behind doing this is that it will help to keep the paint in the confines of your shape because you've wet that paper first. The pigment is going to stop at the edge of the wet area and not continue to move into the dry area of the paper unless you purposefully paint on the dry area. So this just kind of helps to keep the lines clean. Because I want the sky to be a night sky, I'm going to end up making it quite dark. So I'm mixing together two shades of Winsor & Newton Cotman watercolors, Ultramarine, which is a dark true blue, and Payne's Gray, which is a blue-based dark gray. And I'm mixing them together to create the base of this very dark nighttime sky. The watercolors I have here that are in pans are also Winsor & Newton Cotman watercolors, but I prefer to use paint out of a tube when I'm going for darker or more opaque coverage. Because those paints require less water to activate them, they are already wet. You don't need to water them down so much and shear them out to be able to paint with them. So you're able to get a darker, more opaque coverage more quickly and efficiently than if I were to use the Payne's Gray and Ultramarine from my palette, because I'd have to add quite a bit of water to even be able to start painting with that color. Hopefully that makes sense. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments down below and I'll do my best to answer them. So I'm generally following the shape of this top half of the moon, again, just using my Payne's Gray and my Ultramarine. You might notice that I have a lot of brushes here and they're all different shapes and sizes. I find this really helpful while painting. Sometimes I want a really tiny detail brush. Sometimes I want a large brush to fill in a larger area. Sometimes I want a straight edged angled brush to get a nice straight clean line. So if you're able to afford to get some different types of brushes, I highly recommend that because it does make doing an entire painting a lot easier. There are a few spots that I added a bit more pigment than I wanted, and in this case what I'll do is take a clean brush, wet it, and wet the area that I want to remove pigment, and then I'll use a piece of dry, clean paper towel, and I'll dab up the water, and that will also pick up some of the pigment, which will help to lighten that area. This tip works best if the paint is still wet. So I'm going to let this first layer of my sky dry before I keep working on it, and I'm going to move on to the cabin. So I'm using a really tiny detail brush that has a pointed end, and I'm using raw umber, which is a nice warm brown, to paint the outlines of this cabin. Once I have the general shape, I'm also going to fill in the side and front of the cabin because I want this to look like a log cabin. I'm purposefully trying to fill this in an inconsistent way with some darker areas and some lighter areas because I want it to look irregular like a log cabin would look, adding darker areas, leaving some areas lighter and more washed out, and generally trying to add color in a bit of a streaky way so that it looks like there are logs or wood slats. And you can see when I add more water to my brush, it makes the color a lot lighter and more transparent. It's easier to fill a larger area more quickly with a light wash of color. And then I can go back in with a slightly drier brush with more pigment on it to add darker areas. I'm leaving the roof clear because I want the roof to look like it's covered in snow, so we're just going to leave it white. Now I'm gonna let the cabin dry before I keep working on it, and I'm gonna start on the trees. So for this, I'm mixing my own green shade. I'm using the green from my palette as a base green, but it's a bit more of a blue-based, true bright green, and I want it to look a little more like an olive. So I'm mixing that together with my raw umber, which is a brown, to create more of a darker olivey green, which I feel looks a little more natural. I'm going in with that super, super fine detail brush again to start painting in these trees. And I want them to look like evergreens, so I'm kind of going for that classic Christmas tree sort of shape, and just starting very small at the top, making a little irregular triangle essentially at the top, and then kind of sweeping back and forth in an irregular fashion to create the branches, moving down, getting wider as I go down. You can see that sort of sweeping side to side motion, and I'm sort of waving the brush back and forth so that it's not too perfect or too straight, so it looks a little more realistic. I'm also, again, adding some areas with a lighter, more transparent pigment with a wetter brush, and I'm adding some areas with a drier brush and more pigment to get little darker areas and shadows. We will keep adding shadows and dimension later on, but I try to do this from the very start. I'm adding them in different shapes and sizes. Again, that irregularity makes it look more natural. And while I didn't sketch any of these trees out on my watercolor paper, I did do a very quick sketch in my bullet journal, so I'm using that as reference for generally where I want to place all of the different aspects of the painting. And I would highly recommend doing this, sketching out your composition beforehand, not on your watercolor paper, because you don't want too many pencil marks on there that will be hard to erase or impossible once you add paint. But if you have a scrap piece of paper or your bullet journal close by, just sketch out some composition ideas with pencil to kind of figure out what you want to do before you start painting. It really helps a lot. So here's a different angle to see hopefully even more clearly what I'm doing here. Again, just sort of irregular sweeping motions side to side to create these trees with darker areas and lighter areas. I'm also trying to stop the trees along that curve of the moon that I have sketched out. Again, super light in pencil. You probably can't even see it, but I'm doing my best not to go over this line because I will be scanning this painting into my computer and editing it in Photoshop. I'll be able to clean up the lines later, but I'm still trying to make it as clean as possible from the get-go so I have less work to do in post when I'm editing. And yes, I will be putting out a video on Saturday on how I scan and edit my paintings. I'm going to be showing that with the third painting I painted with the cabin straight on, because I felt that painting actually had the most that I did to edit it. So I thought it was the best example to show you, because there were a few more things that I did with that painting in editing that I didn't do with the first two. So watch out for that on Saturday. It's the same process that I did with this painting here. So now that I finished the first layer of trees, I'm going to move on to the lower arc of this crescent moon shape. So I'm going in with some really, really watered down Payne's Gray, quite light, to trace the shape of the crescent moon, and I'm going to blend that out. I want this to look like a shadow, essentially, of the snow that's on the ground. So that's why I'm using Payne's Gray, partially because the shadows on snow I find tend to look like a blue-based gray, especially at nighttime by the light of the moon, and because I want it to mirror the blue and gray mix at the top of the moon, just composition-wise. I think that it's a more beautiful combination that way, that it sort of mirrors that color. I'm also using that same super sheared out Payne's Gray to create shadows on the roof, the snow that's on the roof there. All I do for this is grab a clean dry brush, make it wet, and then I pick up my Payne's Gray and I'll use some blank area on my palette to sort of rub off some of that pigment, brush off some of that pigment. I'll usually add even a little bit more water to that brush before I start adding it to the page. Now that the first layer of the skies had time to dry, I'm gonna go back in and keep working on it. So here again, I'm mixing Payne's Gray and Ultramarine, and I'm starting to fill in some of that blank area that I removed the pigment earlier on. I still want the center of that area to stay light because I want it to sort of look like we're catching the edge of a galaxy or a cluster of stars. And again, I'm adding the pigment in pretty irregular splotches so that it doesn't look too structured or clean. Some areas that I want to be darker, I'm using a relatively dry brush and just a lot of pigment. And the areas that I want more of a wash of color towards the center of the sky, I'm using a much wetter brush with less pigment to get more of a sheer effect. I'm also trying to darken up that top edge of the crescent moon by adding quite a bit of Payne's Gray with not a lot of water so that it's as pigmented as possible. Payne's Gray at its full pigment strength is very close to black, so I'm trying to create an almost black effect without going fully black because it is still a blue-based gray. This process takes quite a bit of time. You really just have to keep adding here and there, letting areas dry to get a feel for what they're going to look like, and then keep adding here and there. That's sort of the fun of watercolor, in my opinion, but I'm sure for some people, the fact that you have to let layers dry and it takes quite a bit of time to finish a painting might be a little frustrating. So I'm going to let that second layer of the sky dry, and I'm going to keep working on the trees. So I'm mixing some more of this olive green, but this time I'm adding a little bit of Payne's Gray to make it an even darker olive green so that I can add some shadows to some of the trees and just add dimension to this forest, because obviously in a forest, no tree looks exactly like another. They are different shapes and sizes, and they also have different shades and colors. So I'm trying to portray that by having some darker olive trees, some lighter olive trees, but I'm still keeping them all in the same color family. All of the trees are still going to have that base of the olive green. That's the mix of the true green from my palette and raw umber, because I want them to still be cohesive. So I'm doing the same sort of wobbly, waggly, side to side technique to create some darker trees and to also add some shadows. I'm primarily focusing the shadows on the left sides of the trees because I want the light to be coming from the upper right hand side. Here I'm grabbing a clean brush and just wetting it, and I'm using it to blend the blue of the sky up and away from the trees a little bit more. Here you can see when I pick up the pigment I've mixed with a lot less water on the brush, I get a much darker color. And that's really a basic technique in watercolor. The more water you add, the lighter and more sheer your color will be. I want to also add some shadow to the cabin to give it more dimension. So again, grabbing the same raw umber with a less wet brush, so it will be a darker, more opaque color. And I'm adding shadow around the edges of the roof, so it looks like there's a bit of an overhang. I'm also adding a bit of shadow to the corner of the cabin to make that distinction clear. And I'm using this darker, more opaque raw umber to add these small, irregular rectangles across the front of the cabin, so it looks again like logs or wood slats. I'm also outlining the door frame in the same way. I'm not outlining the bottom of the cabin because I want it to look like snow has sort of drifted against the cabin, and I don't want there to be a dark brown line in between. I want it to look like the snow has drifted up against it, and that's not actually the bottom of the cabin. It's just all of the cabin that we can see because of the snowdrift. I'm also adding some shadow to the left side of the chimney. And then with a very careful hand, I'm drawing in the panes of the windows. These are by no means perfect, but I kind of like the more rough, rustic feel of this painting, so I didn't spend too much time worrying about it. I decided this tree on the right side looked a little too high, almost like it was floating, so I extended the bottom of the tree a little lower, and I think that makes it look better. I'm continuing to work on the forest. I left this upper left-hand side alone for a little bit so that the area of the sky that I had wet would dry fully, because I didn't want the trees to bleed into the sky. I'm using a clean wet brush to blend out the snow along the bottom a little bit more and adding the tiniest bit more of the Payne's gray, again, very washed out. Then I'm grabbing the yellow from my palette on a clean wet brush and adding a yellow glow to the door and the windows. I explained this in my December Plan With Me video, but I did this so that the cabin would look warm and inviting, like there was a hearty fire inside and whoever's in that cabin was nice and cozy on this winter night. Now I'm going to let the bottom half of the painting dry, and in the meantime, because this second layer of the sky is now dry, I'm going to grab a brush and wet it quite a bit and really coat it in white gouache, which is similar to watercolor. It's a water-based paint, but it's more opaque and pigmented than regular watercolor. So I like to use white gouache for my highlights and accents. So again, I wet a clean brush and I added quite a bit of white gouache to it. And now I'm just tapping it all over the upper area of the painting to get the effect of stars in the sky. I'm covering the lower part of the painting with a paper towel to try to avoid getting white gouache splattered on the lower half of the painting, but I'm not worried about getting any white gouache on the white areas of the paper because you probably won't really be able to see them, and also because in editing I'm going to cut out the background anyway. I'm also going in and adding some stars deliberately with my brush in areas that I feel they should be. I'm using a very light hand for this so that the stars will be nice and small. Now it's time to add the snow to the trees. For this, I'm using my tiniest little detail brush, and again, it is a wet brush with white gouache on it, and I'm just adding white to the top edges of where I'd imagine the branches to be. I'm trying to do this in an irregular fashion, again, so it looks more natural, and trying to avoid covering too much of an individual tree so that you can still see the green shade coming through, but I still want it to look like there's been been quite a bit of snowfall. So the basic technique for this is just to outline the upper edge of all of the branches of every tree with this white, so it looks like the snow has settled on the tops of the branches, and leave the lower sections of the branches free of the white. This is a pretty long process. Again, with watercolors, I have learned it's helpful to be patient. I'm not naturally a very patient person, but I feel like watercolor is helping with that, so that's good. But this is definitely a slow process. I have to keep adding more water and more pigment to my brush when it starts to shear out. I'm also adding white gouache to the bottom part of the painting to add some highlights to the snow along the ground, especially the snow that's right up against the cabin. I want that to be a nice bright white, and also to look a little more irregular again, so it looks like these are snow banks that have sort of drifted against the cabin. And I'm just going to keep doing this technique on the trees until I've added snow to every single tree. This is quite a tedious process, but I usually listen to music or an audiobook or watch a movie or something while I'm painting, so it doesn't get boring for me, and I find painting quite calming and relaxing, so it's also just kind of a nice meditation exercise. I'm adding some white gouache to the right side of the roof there, just so it looks like the snow has piled up on both sides of the roof. It looks a little more realistic, and adding a bit more snow along the edges of the roof on the left side as well. The rest of the painting is literally just me finishing adding snow to all of the trees. Otherwise, we are all finished. So this is the entire process of painting this painting. Once I finished adding the snow, I left the painting to dry for a little bit, and then I removed the tape and put it on a high shelf where my cats couldn't get to it, and left it to dry overnight to make sure that it was 100% fully dry before I tried scanning it. I hope this was helpful for all of you. I hope this was as detailed as you wanted it to be. As always, if you have any questions at all, please leave them in the comments down below and I will do my best to answer them. Also, as always, all of the supplies used in this painting will be listed down below in the description box, so please check that out if you're looking for something specific that I used in this video. If you want to create this painting, I would say the necessities are going to be some sort of watercolor paper, at least one larger brush and one tiny detail brush, a dark gray, a dark blue, a brown, a green, a yellow, and a white for accents. If you have those things, you can recreate this painting. You don't need to use the same brand or type of brushes or paints that I use. This is just what I have. Anyway, I hope this was helpful for you. I'm so excited to see even more of your recreations. I can't wait to see what you do. It warms my heart so much when I get tagged on Instagram and I see that one of you has recreated something I've made. I have to pinch myself every single time. It's so cool. So thank you so much for all of your love on that setup. It really means a lot. And thank you for 40,000 subscribers. This is kind of nuts. I'm so grateful. Welcome all of you. I'm so glad to have you here. While I'm in the midst of thanking people, I would like to extend a hearty thank you to my Plant-Based Bride patron squad. Without my patrons, I could not keep having this channel. They support me and they're also an amazing community. I want to give an extra special thank you to our newest patrons, Cass, Anna, Silja, FK, Anna, Diana, Ruth, and Pearl. Welcome all of you to the squad. If you at home want to join the squad, check out the link in the description box or in the card. We would absolutely love to have you. And watch out for Saturday's video where I'm going to be talking you through the process of scanning a painting into my computer and how I use Photoshop to edit my painting so I can then print it out on either regular paper or sticker paper to put in my bullet journal. Give this video a like if you want to see more videos like this. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you very soon in my next one. Bye, friends.